Hello, 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 everyone. I see folks trickling into the Zoom room. I'm so glad you could make it. For us here on the West Coast, it's the lunch hour. If you're on the East Coast, it's later on in your day. I know how hard it can be, especially for caregivers, to get away in the middle of the day, but we are so grateful to have you here. Welcome to Gender, Work, and Care, Changing Our Stories and the Stories Hollywood Tells. I'm Ebony Adams, Manager of Public Programs here at Women in Film, and I am delighted to welcome you to this conversation. I'd also like to welcome all of our partners without whom we couldn't have put this event together. Partners, Better Life Lab at New America, Caring Across Generations, and Disabled Journalists Association. I am so excited personally about the conversation we're going to have today about how we can all engage with and shift the narratives around care work, labor, and paid leave, both on screen and behind the scenes. To that end, I would like to introduce you to our incredible panelists, or rather tell you who your panelists are going to be. Our incredible moderator will further introduce you. You'll be talking to Aisha Adkins, Cara, Reedy, Terrie, Samundra, and we have great breakout room experts in Toni, Jaramilla, and Lydia, Storie. But for right now, I would like to introduce you to our moderator for the afternoon. Vicki Shabo is a senior fellow at New America's Better Life Lab. She's a gender equity expert, policy advocate, and coalition builder, and she's helped win paid leave, paid sick time, equal pay, and pregnancy fairness policies affecting tens of millions of people across the United States. She's testified in Congress, published numerous opinion pieces, and often provides analysis and insights to journalists and entertainment industry creatives about issues related to gender, work, and care. Everyone, welcome Vicki. Vicki, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ebony, and thank you to Sanaz and Aisha and Janine for helping to put this panel together. I am really excited today to introduce the panelists that we have, and then I'll just do some brief opening remarks. So first we have Cara Reedy, who is the Media Narrative Director at the Disabled Journalists Association, which is a member of Storyline Partners. She's a journalist and a producer who spent 10 years in her career at CNN producing documentaries, as well as writing for various verticals, including Eatocracy and CNN Business. In 2019, she produced her most recent short doc for The Guardian entitled Dwarfism in Me, which was an exploration of the treatment of dwarfs in society, and her handle is @infamouslyshort, if you want to follow along. Next, we have Aisha Adkins, a Constituency Coordinator for Caring Across Generations, an international speaker, and a full-time caregiver to her parents in unceded charity. She's passionate about building an equitable, inclusive, and comprehensive public health and care infrastructure. She's the former executive director of Our Turn to Care, currently sits on the board of both Alter Dementia and Care Generation. And when she's not trying to affect positive systemic change, she enjoys classic film, live music, the great outdoors, and is an aspiring tea connoisseur. And you can find her at Aisha Adkins. And then finally, we have Terrie Samundra, who is a director and screenwriter, whose debut feature is the Netflix original Kaali, Khuhi, which was released internationally in October of 2020. Terrie is in development of her original series, The Ballad of Pooja, an international co-production with US and India studios. And she's recently wrapped work as a staff writer on an undisclosed Netflix series. Very intriguing. She's an alumna of the Sundance Institute International Screenwriters Lab, the SF Film Kenneth Rain and Screenwriting Fellowship, and the Sundance Women in Film Finance Intensive. She's a mentor in the Sundance Uprise program for BIPOC artists. A multicultural artist, Samundra grew up between a rural village in India, a small farming town in Missouri, and along the coast of California. She's represented by the Gersh Agency and the Circle of Confusion. So I am very excited to be here. As Ebony said at the beginning, my background is really as a policy expert and an advocate, and most of my work has focused on trying to get lawmakers to change policies around paid family and medical leave, equal pay, paid sick time, child care, pregnancy discrimination, and so many other issues that both affect folks in the film industry and affect almost every family in the United States with disproportionate effects on women. At a time where policy change sometimes can be hard, it's really important to remember the intersections between policy change and culture change and narrative change and the relationships between those two. And so what we want to do here today is put in context the work-family struggles that folks face, quantify for you and talk about the disproportionate impact on women, especially lower income women, women of color, immigrants, people with We want to make sure today to leave you with the idea that the work-family issues, the care issues that people struggle with are universal. Too often, people see these challenges as individual. They feel alone, they feel unseen, and part of what can help change that is increasing representation and accurate representation on television and in film, showing the way that care can be provided, the kinds of interventions that can help, helping people see their own struggles as part of a universal struggle. The things that I struggle with as a parent may be similar to what my neighbors or people across the street are struggling with, and the kinds of interventions that can help that have been proven around the world and also here in the United States. So with that, I just want to give a little bit of background about what we're going to be talking about. Because we don't have systems in place, because we don't have public interventions, we see challenges when people need to take time away from work to care for a new child, an older, disabled, or ill loved one. When they need to take time for themselves, too often they're facing challenges between the need to provide for their families and the need to provide care for their loved ones or get care for themselves. Nearly 80% of people in the US who are working do not have paid family leave at their jobs. More than 60% don't have paid medical leave for a serious health issue. And what that means is that people are cobbling together solutions. They're going without the care they need. They're leaving their loved ones with unstable care options or struggling to both work and provide care. In addition, millions of people, parents and families, live in areas where childcare is unavailable, so-called childcare deserts, where there are 3 or more children looking for every spot in a childcare facility. And yet parents have to work. We're told in this country that work is the most important thing. And so people are facing struggles. The challenges around childcare have only grown during the pandemic. And we've seen the result in women leaving the workforce in unprecedented numbers, with more than with close to 875,000 still haven't returned. 10 million childcare jobs were lost in this pandemic, and tens of thousands of childcare centers closed. Later in the lifespan, we see tens of millions of people with an aging parent or a loved one with a disability struggling to find paid care or providing unpaid care on their own. And we have people with disabilities, as we'll talk about, disproportionately unemployed because work doesn't work sometimes because of the way our structures are set up. 53 million people today are caring for an older adult, and that's an increase in 9.5 million people from just 6 or 7 years ago. People call it a wave of caregiving, and we don't have the policy interventions to deal with it. And too often we don't talk about these things. They're invisible. Unpaid care is invisible. And paid care, which is one other topic we'll cover today, paid caregiving is often unseen, undervalued. Caregivers who are disproportionately women and women of color, large proportion of immigrants, are poorly compensated, not valued for the care that they provide that makes all other care possible. And our partner in this today, Caring Across Generations, just does incredible work around these issues. And I know Aisha will talk about that as well. All of these challenges people are facing, these individual hidden struggles that make them feel like they are doing something wrong, is really because our systems have failed. We alone are one of the only countries in the world without a paid leave policy. We spend less than almost every other country on earth on childcare and on other care interventions. And because we don't have the care infrastructure in place, because people provide care alone rather than in teams or in squads, they're left with impossible choices between work and family and risking jobs when they do provide care. So we're here because the first step in changing this is to make care and care needs visible in storytelling. Writers and showrunners have an incredible role to play in making care visible, in naming the problem, naming the needs, and pointing towards the solutions that people need so that they don't feel alone, so that they see the issues that they face as connected to others, and so that they can be inspired to take action. We've seen from recent research that the Gina Davis Institute has done, along with a group called Equimundo, how caregiving is often portrayed in a gendered way. And one of the things that we need is for men to take more responsibility and to be more active caregivers. We also see from research that was just released today, I believe, from National Domestic Workers Association, the way that paid care is often invisible and misportrayed. And there is a lot that can be done, and both of those reports have interventions and suggestions for framing, as do some resources that I believe you've been provided from Storyline Partners, the Better Life Lab, Disabled Journalists Association, and Caring Across Generations. Finally, we need storytellers to show the impacts of better policies, better health outcomes, people's ability to keep their jobs and earn higher wages to support their families, women's ability to thrive in the workplace, and a reduction in stigma at work when caregiving is normalized. These are all things that people in real life are facing, and they're things that characters on television shows and in films are facing as well, even if they are invisible. So we've got recommendations for you, but most of all today, we hope to give visibility into what caregivers see and experience, to provide some guidance on storytelling, and to show some possible changes in workplace practices within the industry itself, because I know you all struggle with many of the same things under tough circumstances and a lot of time pressure. We need to change work culture, we need to change policy, and we need people to be seen. So with that, looking forward to digging into the panel. And what we first want to talk about really is personal experiences. As I said, we rarely share. We often think in this country that we are individuals, we pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. We need to do what's best. And that really undermines people's ability to look for collective solutions, as well as to seek solace in others who are going through many of the same things as any of us might be. I came to this issue, I came to paid family leave, which I've been working on for the last 12 years, because I had my own experience. I was a lawyer in a law firm. I had great benefits as a lawyer, but my admin assistant would have had less. I had 100% pay for 5 months. She would have had 60% pay for 12 weeks. And the contractors, the hourly workers in the building, people who were earning lower wages probably had no leave at all. And those kinds of inequities foster more inequities, whether we're talking about health or education or economics or well-being. So I know we all have individual stories here. So Aisha, I'm going to start with you, because so much of what you do is about your own story, but also about collecting stories from other advocates and people that Caring Across Generations works with. So can you talk a little bit about your own story, what you hear from others that sticks with you? All of us, I think, have stories that we've heard from others that really stick with us. And what do you think Hollywood misses when it tells stories about working care?
Thank you, Vicki. Yes, I began providing care for my mother in 2013 when she was diagnosed with dementia. And at the time, I had just begun my first career job out of undergrad. And I was very excited about my potential and my possibility, but also very acutely aware of the fact that it probably wouldn't last because there were no supports in place, no policies in place for employees who found themselves in a situation like mine. And unfortunately, with dementia, it just no longer became safe for her to stay home alone. And because we live in a country where our healthcare benefits are tied often to our employment, my father needed to continue working so that they would both have healthcare coverage. So I, returned home, and I anticipated maybe for a few months. It's been nearly a decade. What I find in speaking with family caregivers, people with disabilities, and older adults across the board are themes of burnout. Certainly, those who have positive relationships with the people for whom they're caring, there's certainly an element of love, but also there is the very real fact that caregiving can be physically taxing. It can be financially draining. And that leads me to the second point, is that care, despite the fact that paid care workers are woefully underpaid, for the consumer, for families and individuals who need to access home and community-based resources like respite care and home care, are paying thousands of dollars per month for these services. And it's creating a financial burden that is beyond anything that anyone could truly prepare for. And I'll say, lastly, isolation. The isolation of, being in a situation where you are having this experience, like you said, Vicki, that so many consider to be singular or assume that they're going through alone. And it's almost kind of the expectation, right, that we figure it out. However, there are government agencies and policies that are put in place to make resources available to families and individuals who find themselves in these circumstances where they are needing assistance with care. However, those programs are woefully under-resourced and very, very difficult to access. So people do find themselves going it alone. And it's really a very unhealthy cycle that continues generation after generation. In terms of, I think what Hollywood tends to miss is the opportunity to create a through line that involves care. Many times when I notice that a character, has an encounter with care, it's very, very temporary, and it's mentioned as kind of an afterthought. And their role as a caregiver tends to end, the arc ends after, if it's like episodic programming, may end after a couple of episodes. And it's the reality is that for people who are giving and receiving care is that it's a far more significant portion of their life. And there are so many different elements that can be included in entertainment that I think are being missed. And it's something that I think so many viewers would appreciate seeing reflected, particularly because care does take place at the intersections of all of our other identities.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we've all been really moved recently by This Is Us and how well they portrayed caregiving. I know Caring Across Generations has done a lot of work to elevate and even create some materials around the way that This Is Us portrayed caregiving in multiple places. And, I think you're right. So many places where shows could insert references to things like the need for childcare, the difficulty finding childcare, the struggles with finding home care, naming when somebody's in the hospital, the fact that they're either losing wages or risking their job and are unlikely to have paid leave. These are all ways to make care visible. Cara, I want to turn to you now. When you and I were talking before this panel in preparation, you said to me something really beautiful. You said caregiving is a relationship. It's not a selfless service, yet everything in our system is made to keep caring for people difficult. And I just thought that summed up so well, so many people's experiences. And I know you are in the midst of your own caregiving experience. You also come at this from a person with disability, as from the perspective of a person who has a disability. And, I think your perspective on being both the person who is cared for sometimes and the person who is providing care and the intersection between those two is just so powerful. So I wonder if you can talk a bit about your experiences and what you see in Hollywood.
So thank you so much. I think what I see in Hollywood mostly is this, you see all these movies where like a person with a disability is inspiration for overcoming their disability. And then there's always some main character, because the disabled person is never the main character. They're always the inspiration character. The main character is the caregiver, who's this selfless person who now has found some magical revelation by being around a disabled person. And that is such a like boring storyline, and it doesn't really reflect what's happening out there. I would say, if you're looking in the African American and Native American communities, a lot of the people that are doing the caregiving are already disabled, because financially we have less resources. We're not going to be able to hire a caregiver, so we just do it in-house. Well, we never tell stories about what that's like for a family that already has lower resources, then having to extend their bodies in ways to achieve this caregiving, while still going out to work and still doing all these other things, because we don't take care of our people here. I never see stories like that. Like, where's that story? And people are always like, but if there's a disabled person, I want some sort of like inspirational resolution. There isn't one. Because first of all, disability is not some miraculous thing. It's a very natural state of being. You won't leave this planet unless you die very young. You won't leave this planet without being disabled. So we need to stop making it some sort of like magical situation where the person has been dropped out of the womb and now everyone around them are going to learn a lesson because the person has a different body type or a different way of thinking. We need to take this down to reality, because part of that feeds into this narrative that we're all individuals rather than we're a collective and a community that takes care of our people, because you've made it this other thing that's miraculous and magical when it's not. It's normal. All of this is normal. And so we need to start taking care of people like it's normal. We also need to start telling stories about people taking care of people as normal. I don't know how many times recently I've been taking care of my parents. And I think when your parents get older, it just hits you and you don't realize that it's coming because we don't talk about it. And so all of a sudden mine hit, and my brother passed away all at the same time. Mine hit. And now I'm saying to my friends, did you guys know this? They're like, no, but we're in it. We're in it. And so then I'm constantly having these conversations. Well, did your parents do this? Like, are you having trouble getting them to do this? Are you having trouble getting resources? Yes, 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 yes. So we've hidden it. We've completely hidden it into this thing like it's not going to happen. So then finally it does happen, where you are a caregiver and we're all standing around going, well, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do Medicare. I don't know any of this, because we've made it a mystery. It's not a mystery. And we need to stop treating it like such and do that in narrative work.
Yeah, such good points. I know I'm in conversations like you are, with folks who are Gen X and millennials. We are the overwhelming share of folks who are caregivers. Often we're what's called sandwiched caregivers, where we have children at home and we're caring for older parents or getting ready to care for older parents. And yet nobody feels like this is something they can talk about. And part of what storytelling can do is normalize it and also point the way towards resources and help. Terrie, I want to turn to you. I know you come at this from a couple of different perspectives, as a parent to a child with disabilities, as a filmmaker who has professionally managed work and family, and you have an adorable cat that has come behind you. So we're
just joining us.
But I wonder if you can talk a bit, you said when we talked earlier that producers often want to compartmentalize being a parent. I wonder if you can talk a bit about the ways that caregiving has intersected with your career, and then pivot us a little bit. You've heard some feedback from this group about what storytellers can do differently. I'm curious if you have some reflections on that or some insights from writers' rooms that you've been in.
Yeah, thank you so much. And, just listening to Aisha and Cara speak, like, so much resonates, so much to learn, and such an important conversation to have. So, I grew up in a Punjabi household, mostly cared for by a collective group of women, and this conversation or this individual versus collective is always constantly running through my mind, like in my family, the way that I work, in my storytelling, the way that I approach my work, both, behind the camera and also like on the page, because I was raised by many aunties in, a village in India, and then also here. And then when my mother became a single mother, you know, I'm the eldest sister of the house. And so it was just culturally expected that I help to raise my sister. You know, I really am one of her caregivers. Even now she's a grown woman, has a great career. I'm still the eldest of the family. And that's, you know, how our culture has been, whether that's good or bad, you know, it's just part of our cultural fabric. And it's expected also, you know, like, just like my mother took care of her younger siblings, it's also, you know, I care for my mother, my family, I have 2 children. So it's just like, I can never separate those things. And, you know, I have been asked and I've been told that when you go into a room, you're going in for an interview or you're going into a room to get a job, to not speak about your family, to not speak about, you know, being a parent. And I can't do that because that's just, it's just part of the fabric of who I am and what I'm going to bring to the table. So if I am not going to talk about that, then you're not going to get the best of who I am and what I can bring to the table and what my value is, whether it's in a writer's room or it's, you know, directing or my own work. So it's just, it's intrinsically part of what we do. And I think it's also, you know, for me, it's like changing the culture of Hollywood, because Hollywood, you know, did what Cara was saying, like, what is normal? Like, we live in families with, you know, elder parents that we care for, siblings, we ourselves are disabled or caring for disabled family members or children. And it's not a separate thing, or even a lot of times like a separate story point. It is just what it is. It's the fabric of how we are existing and living, you know, and I very much care about that. I need to see that too, because there have been so many times where I felt alone. Like, you know, do other families have to go in for like a 504 or an IEP, or like, what is it like to be juggling 5 million things? Or like, you know, even if we talk about class, you know, have you ever seen a character like swipe their EBT card when they're at the grocery store? You know, those kinds of things are so important. And they don't, and it's like a lot of times you don't even have to like have an expository dialogue about them. They're just part of the character's life. So I hope I answered your question. I went off, but you
absolutely
know,
no.
It's hard to compartmentalize because it is just the fabric of who we are. And when our storytelling reflects back to us, not only do we not feel alone, you feel empowered, you know, and because that is the norm. It's not, you know, because a lot of times things are celebrated and they should be celebrated, but they're not singular. They're actually much more normal than, you know, what we've grown up seeing on television in, you know, normal, or like, you know, sitcoms that have always been written from a very singular perspective that nobody I knew growing up related to.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, so much your point about being told to go into the room and pretend you don't have a family. I think workers all across the country are told, don't put pictures of your kids on your desk. If you know, need to go to a doctor's appointment with your child, like, just say it's for you. We hear this time and time again. Mm-hmm. Normalizing, sort of calling out what's wrong with that. And normalizing what we want to see feels so important. You know, we're at this inflection point. We've come through this pandemic where people's family lives and their work lives are intertwined, whether you're a professional worker who's been doing your work on Zoom and you've got kids in the background and kids needing school, or whether you are a frontline worker who's had to manage childcare as childcare centers were closing down, or virtual school, or schools that open and close with new infection outbreaks. People's home lives are much more present in their work lives. And so we're at this inflection point where we could start to change the narratives about what that means and what the interventions are. And the reality is that so many of us, as we've said, are family caregivers now. Often, like, you know, as Cara said, and as some of the research shows, this is portrayed in ways sometimes that aren't very accurate. With men in particular, you know, we're all women on this panel, and that is often a reflection of these conversations. But men also want to be able to provide care. Here at the Better Life Lab, we've done some research on men in caregiving, men feeling like they're stigmatized for providing care or don't have the supports. And then the new research that I just mentioned from the Gina Davis Institute and Equimundo shows how some of the tropes around clueless men or abusive men are reinforced, and they have some suggestions for how to overcome that. But for family caregivers in particular, honoring their commitment to their family members, and then how that plays out in particular for Black families and Latino families and immigrant families also needs to be visible, and it connects to these other issues. So Aisha, I know you have talked publicly about your mom getting diagnosed and misdiagnosed. And I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about the relationship between racism in the healthcare system, the time that it takes to get diagnosed, and the lack of supports, because I think that's a really important intersection to pull out here too.
Most definitely. I think some of there is a long history in this country in particular of the mistreatment of Indigenous folks, of Black folks, the failure to listen to women and to Black women in particular about their healthcare needs. And so obviously the relationship with these care systems that we are dependent on is also a very complicated one. And so something that I learned in that relationship, as I began kind of advocating for my mother, I didn't see it as such. I certainly didn't identify as a caregiver, and most people don't, particularly in communities of color, where, as has been mentioned here today by Terrie and by Cara, it's just kind of what you do, and it's a part of life, and there's a community care that takes place and takes shape. It's something that I knew that I needed to do in order to protect my mother, which was make sure that I'm questioning authority as appropriate, and that I'm not afraid to ask for second, third, and fourth opinions. It took 4 diagnoses for my mother to finally be diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia, which is a rare form of dementia, #1 form of dementia for people under the age of 60. And it, was an accurate diagnosis, which then led to a more accurate treatment plan. There is no cure for dementia, but it helped us understand a bit more what to expect and what our options were for managing symptoms, and also what to consider when we talked about care and when we looked into the future, and when we looked for resources that ultimately were either initially unavailable to us because of my mother's age, because she was only 57 at the age of diagnosis, or because there's ineligibility around Medicaid, which covers long-term care, which is something that most people don't understand. I grew up hearing the term Medicare, and that was synonymous with turning 65 and with receiving your AARP card. So I just assumed you turn this magic number and everyone, gets all this free healthcare and caregiving. And that is not the case. But unfortunately, something else that I have learned in constant conversation with people who are reaching out for these resources is that no one knew this, and there's a lot of misinformation. So I think there's also a way that storytelling can help educate, right, and some of these narratives. But unfortunately, Black and Brown communities are far less likely to have, to have generational wealth, right, and have access to assets that they could maybe sell and then use that for their long-term care costs. And so and the other challenge as well is that for folks who began or entered roles as caregivers at younger ages, I was 27 at the time, and because I entered that role and I had initially graduated into a recession, I was not able to earn a living. So now I'm without healthcare, I'm without a savings account, I'm not paying into a 401k. So not only is my current situation precarious, my future is unknown. And again, it feeds into that generational lack, and in many cases generational trauma, because if you don't have healthcare, you're going to need care. And it's a cycle that really damages a lot of communities, but also offers opportunity for those communities to support one another. And so, it's important to show all aspects of that, and also acknowledge that many of the people, confronting these circumstances, are just middle-class folks with with trying to work, and everything also doesn't have to be abject poverty, even though we know and acknowledge that that is valid and significant and a problem that needs to be addressed. I think they're also, sometimes it can seem more mundane if there aren't these extremes represented, right? And so understanding that audiences are going to be able to relate to characters who are neither wealthy nor, at the poverty level, but just kind of trucking through life every day, I think is important to show, particularly in communities of color.
Makes sense. Terrie or Cara, do you have anything to add here from the perspective of disabled community, immigrant community, Black, Latino community? We're going to sort of wrap up our family caregiver section and pivot to paid caregiving in just a second. So Terrie, sorry, yeah, I see you unmuted.
Oh, I mean, I have so many thoughts around that. I think, what Aisha's saying is so critical, as far as it doesn't have to be when you're, talking about these stories, it doesn't have to be in the extremes either, because I think that sometimes people feel like, okay, well, I don't relate to that. I think that that's so critical. And then also, I think, addressing the class issues that, are such a critical component to this, especially for communities of color, immigrant communities, just from my personal experience, of my mother being an immigrant and not having that generational wealth, anytime, in navigating a medical system, which is, Medicare, Medi-Cal, everything that has to do with it, so much of that is a full-time job, if not more. And if you don't even have, you didn't grow up with the skills of how to navigate that system, financial, knowledge of just financial systems, and also, a family member who's, English is their third language, or, there's so many things that you're navigating. And if you find yourself in that place, like Aisha said, I was very young as well. So, it also affected me and my work and what I was going to do, because those things aren't separate. It's not like, you're not following that trajectory that is somehow blueprinted into our culture of you graduate college at this time, and then this and this, and this is when you become a caregiver, when you already are getting ready for maybe your own retirement, or you have a house and kids and all that kind of thing. So I think that and those issues very much affect our communities in a really critical way, and for me, a lower income working for immigrant community, those were not skills that we grew up with, and so we had to figure those out on our own.
Gotcha. No, I think, and what you've said too, the sort of navigating for programs that do exist, healthcare and other public benefits programs, figuring out how to navigate those while you're also trying to work, where you might not be in front of a computer all day, or you might not be able to make a phone call at a particular time. These are challenges that people face, or you are sitting at a desk all day, but you have a boss that's constantly looking over you and you want to try to hide your family responsibilities. These are things we don't often see, but are happening all the time.
And then translating, you're also you know, you're kind of you're translating for your family members. You're, you know, not just like linguistically, but also culturally and what they mean. And you know, there's a lot more than just like navigating that, you know, government website or phone call.
Yeah, absolutely. Cara, thoughts on this and the family caregiving piece before we turn to paid caregiving?
I just don't think that, I think when I was trying to think about like caregiving and like stories that I'd seen that kind of represented somewhat of what I've been going through, I had to go back to Ron Howard's Parenthood, where there's an older couple that's grandparents, and then his mom or her mom, who's like the great grandma, and the great grandma gets shifted around houses, and what that looks like, because the grandparents are now having to take care of their ne'er-do-well son who shows back up with a kid. And like that to me was the best story, because that's how life happens. Like you don't know what's getting ready to happen, and then all of a sudden somebody shows up and is like, I'm broke, I gotta move in your house, and you gotta move grandma around, all while you're trying to navigate a system that doesn't really want you to get services from. And I think that's also something that we don't really talk about. I got sick about 2 years ago, and I thought, oh, well, I'll apply for Social Security, I can't work. I never got it. I didn't get refused yet. They still call me every 6 months and say, I'm reviewing your application. Okay, I have a job now. Like, don't worry about it. But like, what does that say about people who can't get jobs or who aren't going to get better? And I think there's this myth that we have in the world that if disabled people will just work harder, they can get better, without actually understanding that disability is really just a state of being. And it's okay to be disabled. And if it's okay to be disabled, it's okay for support. And if a family has a disabled member in it, they're already at a disadvantage. And I don't mean that the disabled person is a burden. I mean that our society makes it a burden and makes it this individual thing, which makes no sense, because disability is coming for all of us. And by the time you get wrapped up into disability for yourself, you become disabled, you're so pressed down by the weight of the system, you can't get out of it. And like, you can't, like you're in a constant cat and mouse game trying to keep things going. And I don't think we talk about that. And it doesn't need to be where, you know, it's the only thing in the movie, but it should, or the TV show, but it should show like what life is like. Also, you've got a disabled family member, or you yourself is disabled, you need to show that in your storytelling. Like what the machinations of being disabled is like, not the weird fairy tale crap that, you know, where everybody's going to learn how to care more. It's no, what does this look like that our society does this? Why do we always put everything on the individual? Why don't we talk about how we live in a disabled healthcare? And no one talks about it, because most people don't know about it until they get there, and then no one wants to hear from you once you're there.
Right. This is, I mean, the threads here are pretty consistent, right? Like individualism, misrepresentation or no representation, showing things either as a fairy tale or as a negative trope. And, you know, Cara, you talked about how disability is coming for everyone. We've just been through, we are in the middle of still a pandemic where we now have a huge new tranche of people with long-term health conditions who will need paid sick time, who will need paid medical leave, who will need caregivers to be able to take time from work to provide for them, some of whom may need paid caregivers. And so I want to turn now, you know, we've been talking a lot about unpaid family care, which contributes hundreds of billions of dollars to GDP, but doesn't show up that way because care has so often been provided by women and by history through slavery of Black women. And so we don't value this. Like this is Heather Boucher, who's at the Council of Economic Advisors in the White House, talks about how the American wife is the partner of American business. And of course, that's a particular American wife, a middle or upper class middle American wife, not women who are paid low wages, who have been working to support their families for years. But nonetheless, we devalue unpaid care and the caregiving that goes on in households. We also devalue the paid care that makes all other work possible. So, at the height of COVID, we had 5 million women that were out of work. Some of them were out of work because their jobs went away. And some of those were care jobs like childcare and home care. And a lot of those women, especially women who were paid low wages, had to stay home to take care of children or take care of loved ones, and some of them haven't yet gone back. And so, we're at this inflection point where we should be able to see the value of paid care more. And yet caregivers are not paid high wages. They are often in households where they are vulnerable, or work for agencies where they're taken advantage of. Aisha, I'm going to turn back to you because I know Caring Across has done such a great job pairing the interest of paid care workers and family members, and your sister organization, NEWA, has just done some research on this and how that's depicted in film. So I want to turn to you to talk a little bit about paid caregiving. And then we're going to wrap up in a few minutes talking about the industry. And so just to preview, I'm going to turn to Terrie to talk more about what the industry can do and how to get creators and studios to greenlight things. And then we're going to open it up quickly for questions. So get your questions ready, and then we'll go to breakout sessions just to give folks a preview. So Aisha, paid caregiving, talk to us.
Yes, thank you, Vicki. So yes, as you mentioned, unfortunately, the legacy of paid care in this country begins with, enslaved Africans and also Indigenous folks who did this work against their will. Fast forward to present day, and many of these paid care workers are still earning, they're certainly not earning living wages. And in addition to that, do not have access in many cases to their own health insurance, are not protected under OSHA in terms of workplace protections. And so, Caring Across Generations is dedicated to working with our sister organization, National Domestic Workers Alliance, around, making sure that there are policies in place protecting paid care workers who also, in many cases, are also family caregivers, right? Or people with disabilities. So again, we cannot compartmentalize identity. And, it's about making sure that those who are providing care work for other families, we like to say that care work is the work that makes all other work possible, but it is work and it needs to be valued and resourced and funded as such, because it truly is life or death. And to, my family's caregiver just left maybe 30 minutes ago. And she's phenomenal, but she is doing work that is life-saving. However, we live in a society because there is classism built into the fabric of our society. There is elitism built into that fabric. Her role is not as valued and as celebrated as a physician or a nurse, although she is doing work that is equally as valuable, if not more, because it's about sustaining a quality of life, and that relationship oftentimes is long-term.
Great. If folks have questions for the panel that you'd like to ask, please put them into the chat and we'll get to as many as we can really quickly. But before we turn to that, I want to bring us back to how the industry can do better. There are great examples. So we talked about This Is Us. We've talked about Insecure. We've talked about parenthood going way back. I was struck a couple of weeks ago by a reference to childcare on Grey's Anatomy that I thought was really good. There are good examples. There are a lot of recommendations in some of the materials that you've been provided today and other materials that are out there. But Terrie, talk to us a little bit about how studios can do better, about the importance of bringing culturally competent consultants and narrative experts. How can the industry do better, and what can folks here do to help make that change?
Well, I've had some, bad experiences, but I've also had some really great experiences, which I'd like to talk about. So the last writer's room that I was in, we just had a really phenomenal executive team, and our showrunner was so fantastic. They were so, this is what all showrunners should be doing. So our show's, protagonist is a mother, and the show is so much about her relationship to her children, and there are issues of women's work in there. There's a queer character, and so our room was built to reflect all of that. Like, we all brought that to the table, and kudos to the showrunner, because a lot of times when you look behind the scenes, that's not what's happening in the writer's room. And not only was it about building a really solid room that reflected the story, it was also the way that we worked. Like, we had such an equitable way of working. Like, weekends were respected, evening hours were respected, time to prepare food and have a life. And so every day when we came to the writer's room, we just brought our best selves, and we were happy and rested and excited to work, because we all love the work. But if you can't show up fully, and you're resentful and angry, and you're having to separate your life, and but then you're expected to show up and talk about life and write characters. That's the thing about our work. What we are expected to do is that authentically connect to our audience. So not only is it good for the culture and good for the people that are working, it's actually good business, because good storytelling is good business. And so that was always the interesting thing to me, was that dissonance and disconnect of the executives who are greenlighting or building the spaces. And so I just think, it is happening in small waves, but we need a big cultural shift of who is greenlighting, and are they thinking about all of those things, and for people to also ask for when you are building your writer's room, or you're building your team, or you're building your set, to bake those things in. Bake in the childcare, bake in those things are going to happen. And there's also the contingencies of what happens when people get sick and they need to care for their families, and that it's just normal. It's just what we do. And it's not something that's separate, and it's not something that you have to apologize for. And I think that changes with also who becomes an executive. It's just the face and fabric of the culture has to change, because the culture has always been free labor and separating things. And it also has been, unfortunately, a playground for people who've had generational wealth, because you are expected to do so much free labor, and also to, say yes to everything. So, those are the ways in which I think things can shift. And, for somebody like me who's moving into positions of hiring, those are things that I'm committed to. And so that's also something we have to be committed to, making that change ourselves.
Yeah, diverse representation behind the scenes, so important to what gets made and how people live their lives. I don't see any questions in the chat, so I'm just going to go ahead and ask everyone one final question here, which is, a few years from now, if Hollywood does a better job representing the full lives of people who need and provide care on screen, what would you hope to see? What has changed? And I'll start, and then I'm going to pass it to Cara, Aisha, and then we'll end with Terrie. For me, it's seeing stories about care and caregiving and naming care policies explicitly in all types of stories. So it doesn't have to be a main storyline. It just needs to be present in TV shows, in storylines, in films, the way that it is in people's lives, so that we start to normalize it and so that it starts to be visible. So Cara, I'm gonna turn to you.
I want to see more realistic depictions of life with disabled people, with elderly people, with all of the bells and whistles that come with that, caregiving and everything, because I feel like there's a lot of people that aren't seeing themselves on screen, and I think there's so many stories that we're missing because of it. And you know, there's so many streamers now, and everybody's like, I don't know what to watch, but people end up watching the things that are most authentic, and the rest of the stuff is just noise. And I feel like it's a good business decision to start digging into these stories because people haven't seen them and they want to see them. I come from newsrooms, which are not the same as film and TV, but some of the people that are in charge are the same types of people. And when I was pitching disability stories in newsrooms, I would get this thing back where it was like, oh, nobody cares about that. And I realized the people that are in charge don't care about it because it doesn't affect them. And so not only do I want to see the stories, I feel like the only way we're going to see the stories is if the management changes in a lot of these spaces.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Aisha. And then we'll go to Terrie, and then we'll wrap and send people to breakout rooms if they want to.
Yeah, you know, I spent the last 3 weeks interviewing family caregivers, people with disabilities, and older adults for our 2022 Care Fellowship at Caring Across Generations. And listening to them tell me about storylines that have touched them in This Is Us, in Made, and just a number of other programs that are available, it really brought to mind one of my favorite lines that I always return to from a television series, the show 911 that airs on Fox. When Connie Britton was on that show, she was a caregiver for her mother. And I remember her character telling a colleague, it's kind of hard to date with your mother dying in the other room. And then her mother died at the end of the season, and that was it. There was no more caregiving storyline. So I would love to see it really take up more space and see what those intersections are like and see the joy of even navigating some of those situations. I think that would be really fruitful.
Terrie, thank you.
What would I like to see? I mean, I would like to see reflected back what is normal, on screen. And, like this beautiful messiness, this complexity of our lives is really what connects us. That's our human story. And, I think that the nuance, like the specificity and the cultural nuance, all those things, I actually think I resonate more with that. I think everybody does. That actually makes it more authentic, and it makes it more universal, that specificity, than just like generic kind of washed out stories. Like, they're so boring. They're not interesting. People don't want them. And I think that what Cara said is right. It's like, a lot of times the people who are greenlighting are the ones that it doesn't affect them, so they don't want to deal with it. But that's what I want to see. I want to see, and I want to see what is normal, what I know everybody in my life is dealing with, and everybody that I meet. I want that reflected on screen.
Yeah, 53 million caregivers to family members, 20 million people a year who need a family and medical leave. These are fundamentally human stories, human dramas, sometimes human comedies. Well, thank you so much, Aisha, Cara, and Terrie. I'm going to turn it back to Ebony, who is going to explain how the breakout rooms work if folks want to stay. So thank you so much. And again to Ebony and Aisha from Women in Film for doing the tech here, and Janine and Sanaz at Storyline Partners as well.
Of course, this was fantastic. Yes, please don't disappear. If you're still in the room, do not leave, because we have the opportunity, you have the opportunity to speak to some amazing experts in our 2 breakout rooms. We're not going to keep you long. We know people in this room, if you're caregivers, you got stuff to do. And if you're not a caregiver now, you might just got to go back to work. We get it. But we also know that some of y'all have questions about like employment law, workers' rights around caregiving issues. So we have a breakout room session. It's led by Toni Jaramilla, who's a civil rights attorney, amazing, amazing expert. And then we have a room on storytelling and narrative change, which is going to be led by Lydia Storie from Caring Across Generations. I believe Vicki is also going to be in that room, and some else from Storyline Partners. So yes, we're going to assign people to rooms now. Please feel free to ask those experts any questions that you have. If you want to just offer perspectives about the conversation that we just had, that would be great, you know, and we really want you to have the opportunity to really dig into this topic with folks who know what they're talking about. So we're going to start putting folks in breakout rooms now. And then, you know, once the rooms are over, you don't need to come back to the main room. We can dismiss you from here. But I do want to say again, thank you so much to our partners at Storyline Partners, Better Life Lab at New America, Disabled Journalists Association, Caring Across Generations, our amazing panelists, Cara, Reedy, Aisha, Adkins, Terrie, Samundra. Vicki, you are amazing as a moderator. Thank you so much. So stay tuned, stick around for the breakout rooms. You're gonna learn something, I promise you. All right, thanks everyone.